June 19, 1944, dawn breaks over the Philippine Sea. A formation of Japanese bombers slices through the pale sky, their engines humming like a swarm of locusts over the endless blue. The pilots are calm, confident. They believe the Americans below have no idea they're coming. But hundreds of miles away, inside a dim operations room aboard the USS Lexington, green blips flicker across a circular screen. A soft hum fills the air as young radar operators track the approaching wave. Sweat glistens on their faces. One leans closer, whispering, "They're coming straight at us." Moments later, the call goes out across the fleet. Bogies inbound, bearing 320. On carrier decks, pilots sprint to their planes. The ocean erupts with the roar of engines. What the Japanese never realized that morning was this: America had been watching long before they appeared on the horizon. The era of surprise was over, and it all began with invisible waves, born from science, refined in secrecy, and unleashed across the vast Pacific. In 1941, the Pacific was a vast, silent battleground waiting to ignite. Japan's Imperial Navy ruled the waves, striking deep into Asia and the Pacific Islands. Their Zero fighters and long-range bombers gave them speed and dominance, a seemingly invincible force. Across the ocean, the United States watched, unprepared for what was coming. At the time, the idea of detecting planes before they appeared in the sky sounded almost supernatural. Yet deep within military research centers, a handful of physicists and engineers were already shaping a revolution: the power to see with radio waves. America's early radar experiments had begun in the 1930s. The Army Signal Corps at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, and the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, D.C. were quietly building prototypes that could bounce electromagnetic signals off aircraft. One of these devices, the SCR-270 radar, could detect planes nearly 150 miles away. It was bulky, crude, and often unreliable, but it worked. By late 1941, a handful of radar stations dotted the Pacific outposts: Hawaii, the Philippines, and several small island bases. Few commanders truly understood their potential. To many officers, radar was a scientific curiosity, not a decisive weapon. Then came December 7, 1941. Early that morning, two privates, George Elliott and Joseph Lockard, were on duty at a remote radar station on Oahu's northern tip. At 7:02 a.m., their oscilloscope showed a massive formation of planes approaching from the north. They called in the warning, but it was dismissed as friendly bombers arriving from the mainland. Minutes later, Pearl Harbor was engulfed in flames. That failure was a brutal teacher. Within hours, America realized what it had nearly prevented, and how. Radar could have changed everything. In the wake of the attack, radar development accelerated like never before. Scientists from MIT, Harvard, and Bell Labs were pulled into a secret collaboration, the MIT Radiation Laboratory, or simply the RAD Lab. There, under tight security, the United States began designing compact mobile radar systems capable of guiding fighters, spotting ships, and detecting enemy aircraft through storm or darkness. As 1942 unfolded, the Pacific became a proving ground. Radar sets were mounted on ships, carriers, and newly built island outposts. In Hawaii, operators trained day and night to interpret the strange glowing echoes that represented enemy planes. The U.S. Army Air Forces deployed radar-equipped B-17s for long-range patrols, while Navy destroyers tested surface search radars to track Japanese submarines. The technology was advancing fast, but the art of using it was still being written. Commanders struggled to trust a screen over their instincts. Pilots didn't yet understand how to respond to radar intercept directions. Many units lacked coordination. A warning from one island might never reach the fleet in time. But beneath the confusion, a network was forming, fragile, incomplete, yet growing with each passing month. America's engineers were turning raw electromagnetic waves into the eyes and ears of the Pacific. This was the first stage of transformation, from blindness to awareness. And soon that awareness would evolve into a weapon that Japan could neither detect nor defeat: After Pearl Harbor, the United States was a nation both humiliated and determined. Washington's war planners understood that the Pacific was not a battlefield of cities. It was a battlefield of distance. Thousands of miles of open ocean, scattered islands, and isolated fleets meant one thing: whoever could see first would win. In early 1942, the U.S. Navy began constructing a chain of radar stations across the Pacific. These were not grand installations, often just crude shacks or tents perched on cliffs, each holding a single antenna rotating endlessly in the salt wind. They called it the Early Warning Radar Network. Each site reported to regional command centers via radio. When a radar operator saw blips approaching, the data was relayed, filtered, and passed to anti-aircraft batteries or naval forces. It was an early form of networked warfare, analog, slow, but revolutionary for its time. One of the key masterminds behind this growing system was Commander Joseph Rochefort, the brilliant codebreaker who led Station Hypo in Hawaii. Though primarily a cryptanalyst, Rochefort worked closely with radar teams and fleet intelligence to merge radar detections with decrypted Japanese communications. The result was powerful. Radar didn't just see the enemy, it confirmed what the enemy intended to do. Meanwhile, on the mainland, the MIT Radiation Lab was racing ahead. Scientists there refined the microwave radar, a smaller, far more precise technology using cavity magnetrons, a British invention shared through wartime cooperation. This new generation of radars could detect aircraft at lower altitudes, track faster targets, and fit aboard ships and even aircraft. By mid-1943, radar coverage stretched from Midway to Guadalcanal, from the Aleutians in the north to the Solomon Islands in the south. The Pacific Ocean, once a vast blind expanse, was slowly being filled with invisible nets of radio waves. For the U.S. Navy, radar became both shield and sword. Carriers like the USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown now bristled with rotating dishes atop their towers, feeding information to combat information centers, the CICs. Inside these darkened rooms, officers stood before glowing screens, plotting enemy movements and vectoring interceptors with unprecedented precision. By contrast, the Japanese Navy struggled to adapt. Japan had radar too, primitive sets like the Type II Mark II built by Toshiba. But production was slow, accuracy poor, and commanders distrusted it. Japanese doctrine still favored the traditional virtues of visual reconnaissance and instinct. Many officers believed that the human eye and the warrior's spirit could outperform any machine. That belief would cost them dearly. In 1943, radar-directed American fighters began ambushing Japanese bombers before they ever reached their targets. At Guadalcanal, Marine radar operators detected incoming raids early enough to scramble Wildcats into the perfect intercept altitude. In the Solomon Islands, destroyers used surface search radar to navigate night battles that left Japanese ships burning in total darkness. Every success was a lesson, every radar echo a glimpse of a new kind of warfare, one where information meant survival. By 1944, the Pacific was no longer Japan's domain of surprise. The United States had built an empire of detection. It was fast, invisible, and relentless, a silent guardian that watched from every horizon. Soon, it would face its ultimate test, when the Japanese would launch their largest carrier strike since Pearl Harbor and find their enemy already waiting for them. To understand radar's true power, we must first grasp its elegant simplicity. A transmitter sends a pulse of radio energy into the air. When that pulse hits a solid object, and a ship, a plane, even a cloud, part of it bounces back. Measure the time it takes to return, and you know how far away the object is. Measure the direction of the antenna, and you know where it's coming from. It sounds simple, but in 1942, this principle was cutting-edge science, a marvel of physics and engineering. The U.S. Army's SCR-270S and SCR-271 radars were among the first to operate effectively across vast distances. Standing like skeletal towers of steel mesh, their oscillating beams could pick up a formation of aircraft more than 100 miles away. These systems, however, were cumbersome, requiring trucks, generators, and a crew of trained operators. The breakthrough came when radar became smaller, sharper, faster. By mid-war, thanks to the cavity magnetron, a British invention, refined by MIT's radiation lab. Radar signals jumped from meter wavelengths to centimeters. The shorter the wavelength, the finer the detail. Suddenly, radar could detect not just squadrons but individual planes, not just islands but periscopes on submarines. The U.S. Navy quickly installed the new key radars on carriers and cruisers. Their spinning antennas gave commanders a complete picture of the air and sea around them, day or night in fog or rain. This invisible vision changed everything. A carrier group could now spot approaching aircraft before lookouts ever saw them. A destroyer could detect a lurking submarine before its periscope surfaced. Even the unpredictable Pacific weather, clouds, darkness, sudden storms, could no longer hide the enemy. The technology didn't just extend human sight, it transformed it. For the first time in history, commanders could make decisions not by intuition or rumor but by data. And that data flowed continuously, pulsing through radios, teletypes, and voices echoing across the Pacific Command. Radar was no longer a tool. It was a nervous system, the senses of a continent-spanning military machine. Before radar, naval warfare in the Pacific was an act of faith. Fleets moved blindly across thousands of miles, guided by reconnaissance planes that often vanished into storms. Air raids depended on timing and luck. Night battles were deadly confusion, friend and foe indistinguishable in the dark. Radar shattered that uncertainty. With real-time detection, the U.S. Navy rewrote its tactics almost overnight. Carrier. Task forces began to establish combat information centers, CICs. Dark rooms filled with glowing radar scopes, plotting boards, and young officers wearing headphones. Here, radar data was analyzed, filtered, and turned into commands. When blips appeared, controllers calculated intercept courses and radioed fighter squadrons into position long before enemy planes arrived. The results were staggering. During the Battle of Guadalcanal. In 1942, radar-guided intercepts allowed American pilots to catch Japanese bombers as they approached, breaking their formations before they could strike. In night engagements, destroyers equipped with SG radar stalked Japanese cruisers with surgical precision, launching torpedoes into targets they could not even see. Radar brought order to chaos. No longer did battles depend solely on eyesight or sunlight. Coordination replaced confusion. Information became the decisive weapon. The Japanese, who once relied on surprise, found themselves hunted by an enemy that seemed to know their every move. What they didn't realize was that their movements were being painted in invisible light, tracked by silent operators thousands of miles away. It was a shift so profound that one admiral later remarked, "Radar took the guesswork out of war. It made night as bright as day." This new tactical doctrine, built on data, discipline, and rapid response, would soon reach its ultimate expression in one of the greatest aerial battles of the Pacific War. But before that, we must look at the people who made this invisible empire possible, the human eyes behind the screens. Radar was not an automatic guardian. It required patience, endurance, and human intuition. Operators were often young, barely out of high school, trained in weeks, not months. They worked in cramped, dimly lit huts or steel compartments, listening to the steady pulse of equipment that never slept. Many were stationed on lonely Pacific outposts, Wake Island, Midway, Guadalcanal. The wind howled through palm trees, salt corroded everything, and tropical storms rattled their fragile antennas. But the duty was constant. Stare at the screen, track the blips, never miss the faint echo that could mean hundreds of lives. The radar display itself was hypnotic, a glowing green circle with sweeping lines, each revolution searching the sky. To the untrained eye, it looked meaningless. But to a skilled operator, those fleeting arcs told a story. Altitude, formation size, direction, speed. They learned to trust instinct as much as equipment. A false echo from a storm cloud had a different rhythm, a softer return. An approaching formation moved like a heartbeat, regular, steady, deadly. At night, their job felt almost supernatural. They could see without light, know without looking. And yet, Their victories were often invisible, uncelebrated. When interceptors destroyed an enemy squadron before it reached the fleet, few knew that it began with a tired young man staring into a screen on a remote island. Radar operators lived in isolation, often under threat of attack. Some stations were bombed or overrun. Others remained hidden, transmitting until the very end. Their work was quiet, unseen, but essential. The pulse that guided the Pacific defense. For them, radar wasn't just technology. It was responsibility, the weight of knowing before anyone else did. While radar provided vision, leadership gave it meaning. By 1943, U.S. commanders were learning to weave radar into every layer of decision-making, from fleet movements to aerial intercepts. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, recognized early that intelligence and detection were the twin pillars of victory. Working with codebreakers like Joseph Rochefort and radar scientists from the MIT Radiation Lab, Nimitz created a command culture built on information dominance. At Pearl Harbor's underground HQ, messages streamed in, intercepted codes, reconnaissance reports, radar detections. Each was a piece of a larger puzzle. For the first time in naval history, decisions were being made not hours late, but minutes in real time. Radar wasn't just for defense, it became a tool of prediction. By analyzing flight paths and timing, commanders could infer Japanese strategy, which fleet was moving, which island was next. Combined with decrypted radio traffic, radar plots often confirmed intelligence long before Japanese attacks began. This synergy, code breaking and radar, was devastating. When Japanese carrier groups assembled for major strikes, U.S. forces were already positioning for defense or counterattack. The enemy believed they were unseen, but in truth, their formations were glowing across Allied radar screens hundreds of miles away. As one intelligence officer later recalled, "We had taken away the fog of war. What remained was mathematics." Leadership in the Pacific was no longer about instinct alone. It was about synthesis, merging human insight, machine data, and strategic timing. This balance would define the coming battles. For Japanese pilots, the change was terrifying. In 1942, they owned the skies. Surprise was their greatest weapon. Their tactics relied on stealth, appearing out of the clouds, striking hard, and vanishing. But by 1944, something had changed. Their raids were intercepted too early, their formations shattered before reaching targets. American fighters seemed to appear from nowhere, already waiting at the perfect altitude. Pilots reported confusion, disbelief, even fear. Japanese intelligence began to suspect a vast American detection network. Some believed it was magic, others a new type of aircraft. Only a few high-ranking officers knew the truth, that America had mastered radar, a technology Japan had underestimated. Even when Japan deployed its own radar systems, their limitations were severe. Equipment shortages, poor training, and rigid command structures meant data was often ignored or delayed. A Japanese radar warning could take 10 minutes to reach fighter units. By then, it was too late. This imbalance grew catastrophic. In battle after battle, Japanese squadrons vanished into radar-guided ambushes. Their confidence faded. Their famed discipline turned to hesitation. For an air force built on precision and spirit, the loss of surprise was the loss of identity. And by the summer of 1944, that loss would reach its breaking point. Because what came next would be the battle that ended Japan's control of the Pacific sky. The day their finest pilots faced an enemy who had already seen them coming. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, June 19, 1944, at sunrise, the Pacific was deceptively calm. Far below the thin clouds, two armadas faced each other across hundreds of miles of open ocean. The might of the U.S. Fifth Fleet under Admiral Raymond Spruance and Japan's remaining carrier strike force, led by Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa. For Japan, this was supposed to be redemption. Operation Ago, a massive plan to crush the American invasion of the Marianas. More than 400 aircraft were prepared to launch from 9 carriers. If successful, they would halt the U.S. advance and restore Japan's fading dominance. The Japanese pilots, many of them barely trained replacements, were told their enemy was blind to their approach. But they were wrong. Hours before the first Japanese bombers even took off, American radar screens were already alive. On the carriers, USS Lexington, Enterprise, and Hornet, radar operators saw the first faint blips, distant, steady, and unmistakable. Inside the combat information centers, voices crackled through the darkness. Large formation bearing 270, range 150 miles. The invisible network that had been built over years was now fully awake. Orders rippled through the fleet. Fighter directors calculated headings, and within minutes, hundreds of F-6F Hellcats roared from the decks into the sunlit sky. The Japanese formation flew on, unaware. Their navigators believed they were undetected, their timing perfect. But at 10:36 a.m., just as they neared the American fleet, blue shapes appeared out of the clouds. The trap had already been set. Radar-guided American fighters struck with precision. The first wave of Japanese bombers was annihilated before reaching their targets. Those who survived were met by naval flak, their torpedoes falling harmlessly into the sea. By midday, radar operators on the Lexington tracked 2 more enemy waves approaching. Each time, the same pattern unfolded: detection, interception, destruction. From his flagship, Admiral Spruance watched as reports flooded in. Bogies intercepted, all shot down. By afternoon, nearly 300 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed. American losses were minimal. The battle became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. To the public, it sounded like an exaggeration, but to the men who fought, it was brutally accurate. The Japanese Navy had lost the core of its air power in a single day, and the weapon that made it possible wasn't just the Hellcat or the carrier, it was radar. Radar had guided the intercepts, tracked returning squadrons, and coordinated defenses with mathematical precision. It allowed Admiral Spruance to hold his fleet steady instead of charging blindly forward. It gave his pilots the advantage of altitude, direction, and timing. When the sun set over the Philippine Sea, the ocean was littered with wreckage and oil slicks stretching for miles. Japan's naval aviation, once feared across the Pacific, was broken. Admiral Ozawa's fleet limped away with only a fraction of its airmen alive. Many of the survivors were so shaken they described it later as fighting ghosts. They never saw the enemy first. They never understood how they had been found. In the dim radar rooms of the American carriers, operators watched as the blips slowly vanished from their screens, not from radar failure, but from reality. The sky had been cleared. The network had done its work. For Japan, the meaning of that day was devastating. The age of surprise, the age of instinct, the age of the warrior's eye, was over. And as the American fleet advanced toward the home, Island's radar would continue to guide every strike, every interception, every step closer to Japan itself. But the Japanese would not stop trying. In the months that followed, they launched desperate counterattacks, and once again, they would find the enemy already waiting. In the months after the disaster over the Marianas, Japan's naval air arm was a shell of its former self. Yet Tokyo refused to yield. From shattered airfields across the Pacific, the remnants of the Imperial Navy regrouped. Their goal, to strike again, to regain the element of surprise that once defined them. But the Pacific was no longer the same ocean. It was now mapped by invisible lines of radio energy, watched day and night by American radar networks that stretched from island to island, from Hawaii to Guam, from the Marshalls to the Philippines. The next great test came in Operation Hailstone, the U.S. raid on Truk Lagoon in February 1944. Though it preceded the Philippine Sea, it marked the first time radar completely rewrote the rhythm of aerial warfare. Truk, known as the Gibraltar of the Pacific, was Japan's main forward base, ringed with anti-aircraft guns, airfields, and anchored warships. American commanders knew attacking it head-on would be suicide without total surprise. Radar made that possible in reverse. Before the first bomb fell, long-range reconnaissance aircraft equipped with radar had mapped Truk's defenses, detecting ship concentrations even at night. Carrier task forces closed in under cover of darkness, their radar plotting every movement of the enemy. When dawn broke, American fighters struck with surgical precision. For 2 days, the sky above Truk was filled with smoke and flame. Japanese pilots scrambled desperately, but their radarless defenses left them blind. American interceptors picked them off before they could climb to altitude. By the end of the raid, 40 ships and 250 aircraft were destroyed. The base was neutralized. Truk proved a truth that the Battle of the Philippine Sea would confirm. Radar didn't just defend, it enabled total control. By 1945, radar had become the backbone of Allied defense and assault alike. The island of Okinawa, Japan's final bastion before the home islands, became a proving ground for radar-directed warfare on an unprecedented scale. The American invasion fleet was vast, more than 2,400 ships spread across the sea. But with it came the most advanced radar network of the war. Hundreds of radar picket ships, destroyers positioned miles ahead of the main fleet, forming a living wall of detection. Each ship bristled with antennas, scanning the skies for Japanese aircraft. They had one task: to spot kamikazes before they struck. When radar screens showed incoming blips, warnings flashed through the entire fleet. Fighters from carriers such as Bunker Hill and Essex launched within minutes, guided by radar intercept vectors. It was a race against death. The kamikaze threat was relentless, hundreds of suicide planes diving out of the sun, intent on annihilation. Yet without radar, the losses would have been apocalyptic. The radar pickets paid a terrible price. Many were destroyed while shielding the fleet, but their sacrifice saved thousands. Time and again, their early warnings allowed interceptors to destroy attackers before they reached the core of the armada. At Okinawa, radar's full potential was realized. Integration of air defense, fleet coordination, and command intelligence in one seamless network. It was not perfect, no system ever is, but it transformed chaos into structure. Japan's pilots began to speak of American prophetic vision. They could not understand how, in every raid, enemy fighters appeared from the clouds at precisely the right time and place. They believed the Americans had divine foresight. In truth, it was the hum of machines, the rhythm of rotating antennas, and the patience of countless unseen operators. After Okinawa, Japan had no remaining illusion of surprise. Their air strategy collapsed entirely. Fuel shortages, lack of trained pilots, and the devastation of their industrial base made recovery impossible. The radar shield now covered the Pacific like a vast dome, ensuring that no significant Japanese force could move unseen. What radar had done was more than technological. It was psychological. It stripped away the fear of the unknown. For American forces, confidence replaced caution. For Japan, despair replaced pride. Even as the atomic bomb loomed on the horizon, it was radar that ensured the skies were safe for the bombers to fly, the fleets to advance, the war to end. By 1945, the electromagnetic pulses that once danced silently over the Pacific had become the heartbeat of victory. The war's turning point was not only fought with bullets and steel, it was fought with waves of energy, flickering screens, and the courage to trust what could not be seen. And when the guns finally fell silent, those who had watched the blips disappear from their scopes knew they had witnessed the moment when mankind's understanding of war itself had changed forever. When the smoke cleared over the Philippine Sea and Okinawa, the scale of change was beyond comprehension. Radar had not just saved fleets, it had rewritten the balance of power across the entire Pacific. The Battle of the Philippine Sea alone marked the effective end of Japan's naval air arm. Of the 373 Japanese aircraft launched in the battle, nearly 300 were destroyed in a single day. American losses, only about 30 planes. The ratio, 10-1, was unprecedented in aviation history. It was not luck. It was radar. American radar picket ships and carrier-based combat information centers had tracked every incoming wave, directing fighters into perfect interception courses. Even aircraft returning from strikes were guided safely home through thick clouds and fading light. In the months that followed, Radar technology became inseparable from every branch of the Allied military. On land, radar-directed anti-aircraft guns shielded newly captured airfields in the Marianas. At sea, ships could coordinate in total darkness, their movements synchronized through a shared electronic picture. In the air, radar-equipped night fighters like the P-61 Black Widow hunted enemy bombers that once operated with impunity. For Japan, the contrast was catastrophic. Though Japanese scientists had developed early radar prototypes as far back as 1941, such as the Type 1 Model 1 and later the Type 2 Mark II, they were hampered by industrial shortages, lack of trained personnel, and isolation from Western scientific advances. Japan could produce only a fraction of the radar units needed to defend its sprawling empire. Even when radar warnings were received, command chains were slow and rigid. Data might travel from a detection station to headquarters, then to an airfield, before pilots could even start their engines. By the time they reached altitude, the enemy was gone. Meanwhile, the United States was producing radar systems by the thousands. Factories in Massachusetts, New York, and California churned out compact radar sets small enough to fit on patrol boats, aircraft, and submarines. The MIT Radiation Lab alone designed more than 100 different radar types during the war. By 1945, the Pacific was dotted with radar installations, from the Aleutians to the Philippines, from Iwo Jima to Guam. These stations created a continuous detection arc that no Japanese aircraft could penetrate unseen. Radar had also saved lives in another way, by minimizing the element of surprise. Fleets no longer sailed blind into ambushes. Convoys avoided submarine packs. Night fighters intercepted bombers before they reached cities. For the first time, in modern warfare, technology provided foresight, a preview of danger that once came without warning. The Japanese tried to counter it. They experimented with radar jammers, deceptive flight paths, and even wooden aircraft designed to reflect less radar energy. But none of it could close the gap. America's radar technology was evolving faster than Japan's entire wartime research network could comprehend. What had begun as a crude invention in the pre-war labs of Fort Monmouth and the Naval Research Laboratory had become, by 1945, a continental web of awareness, invisible, precise, and decisive. Yet the war was not over. As Japan prepared for its final defense and America moved toward the ultimate blow, radar's influence would stretch even further, shaping strategy, morale, and the very psychology of the war's final months. By mid-1945, Japan was fighting a war it could no longer see. Its pilots took off into silence, unaware that American radars were already tracking their every move, long before they reached the ocean's edge. The most chilling example came during the final months of the war, when Japan began deploying kamikaze units in desperate waves against Allied fleets near Okinawa. These pilots flew with unwavering resolve, guided by honor and hopelessness. Yet even their suicidal determination could not break through the invisible wall of America's radar defense. From picket destroyers stationed miles ahead of the main fleet, radar screens lit up with arcs of incoming signals. Within moments, the combat information centers aboard carriers scrambled interceptors, while shipboard gunners locked their weapons by radar guidance. Kamikaze attacks that once seemed unstoppable were now anticipated, tracked, and destroyed before impact. Still, the cost was immense. Dozens of picket ships were sunk or damaged. Thousands of sailors died. But the defense line held, because radar gave them warning. Without it, the U.S. Navy might have lost entire carrier groups. This unseen vigilance changed more than tactics. It changed the psychology of war. Commanders no longer relied solely on instinct or visual scouts. They trusted machines, cold objective instruments that saw beyond human limits. It marked a shift in warfare itself, from human perception to technological awareness. Radar's role extended beyond the battlefield. It guided B-29 superfortresses over Japan, allowing them to bomb through thick clouds and darkness. It directed search and rescue aircraft to downed pilots floating in the Pacific. It even helped coordinate the massive logistical web that sustained U.S. operations across thousands of miles of ocean. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, radar stood among the unsung victors. It had not delivered the decisive blow, but it had prevented countless others. In post-war assessments, Japanese officers admitted their shock at how comprehensive America's radar network had become. At Okinawa, one Japanese air commander confessed that no surprise was possible and every movement was known before we arrived. Captured technical reports showed that Japan had underestimated radar's potential until it was too late. Their research teams lacked magnetron production, the very component that gave Allied radar its extraordinary range and precision. In the months that followed, radar's influence only deepened. The same scientists who had developed wartime radar systems turned their knowledge toward peace, creating the foundations for air traffic control, meteorology, and the early warning systems of the Cold War. For the United States, radar had done more than win a war. It had ushered in a new military doctrine, one built on information dominance, seeing first, striking first, and never being surprised again. And for Japan, it became a bitter lesson in technological disparity, a realization that courage alone could not overcome the power of science. Radar had not merely changed the war, it had changed the very definition of warfare. The Pacific's silent echoes faded, but the technology that had filled its skies would go on to shape every conflict that followed, from Korea to Vietnam, and beyond. From that invisible screen of green light, the modern world of electronic warfare was born, and with that realization, the story draws toward its quiet reflection, what this transformation meant not just for nations, but for humanity itself. In the end, radar was not just a machine. It was a revelation, the first time in human history that men could see the unseen. Across the vast Pacific, the war had taught a simple truth: knowledge is power. Every blip of light on a radar scope represented more than a target. It was foresight, awareness, and survival. The soldiers who once fought by instinct now fought with information, and that changed everything. Japan's pilots had entered the war believing courage and skill could conquer any enemy. For a time they were right, but radar marked the moment when courage met calculation, when science tipped the scales beyond human will. No matter how brave, no aircraft could outrun a signal moving at the speed of light. For America, radar became the silent guardian of the Pacific, the invisible shield that turned fear into control. It allowed commanders to think, to plan, to act not in chaos but with clarity. It was as if the fog of war had been lifted, revealing the entire ocean in one luminous sweep. After 1945, those glowing screens never dimmed. They evolved into missile tracking systems, weather monitors, air traffic towers, and even the satellites that now watch over the world. The same invisible waves that once warned of enemy bombers now guide airplanes safely home and predict storms before they strike. In every signal, in every sweep of light across a modern radar display, echoes of the Pacific War still linger, reminders of the men who first learned to trust an invisible guardian. History often remembers the thunder, the explosions, the engines, the victories. But sometimes, it is the silence between those sounds, the hum of a radar station in the dark, that defines an era. And so, the story of radar in the Pacific is not only about how Japan's ambush plans failed, it is about how humanity learned to look beyond the horizon and never again be truly blind.